Today's lesson is The Redemption of Jean Valjean, an excerpt from Les Miserables. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And it's our literature unit for the month of June. We're going to be talking about a book, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about an excerpt from this book. That just means a part of this book, and it's all about Jean Valjean, that character from Les Miserables. I guess that just means the miserable ones.
The Miserables, yes, the miserable ones. Of course, a very famous novel by Victor Hugo, the well-known French author who also gave us The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And it turned into a very successful musical that I guess probably more people these days are familiar with the story of Les Miserables from the musical than from the novel, but it has been entertaining people for a couple of centuries now. And one of the main characters, as you know if you've read the book, seen the musical, or seen the Hollywood version, and I believe there's older versions in film form of this story, you will know one of the main characters as being Jean Valjean. So let's find out all about Jean Valjean's life there as he's living in France when many of these troubles and stories happened, and this is going to give us a little bit of an insight into the story, into the novel. It'll be an introduction for those of us who don't know it, and also a reminder of how great the story is and what some of the characters do for those of you who have read or watched the story before. So let's find out all about the interesting and challenging life of Monsieur Jean Valjean. The Redemption of Jean Valjean, an excerpt from Les Miserables. Jean Valjean had not had it easy. Born in 1796 to a peasant family in France, he lost both parents as a child and was raised by his older sister. So, when her husband died soon after Jean turned 25, Jean took on the burden of supporting her and her 7 young children.
大家好，第一部分介绍名词 peasant。这个单字特别是指欧洲旧时或贫穷国家的农夫或是农民。例如 During the Industrial Revolution, many peasants moved to cities to work in factories. 工业革命期间，许多农民移居城市，到工厂讨生活。或者 The peasant worked hard in the fields every day to ensure a good harvest. 该农夫每天在田里辛勤工作，以确保丰收。
Okay, now here in the title we have the word redemption. We're talking about the redemption of Jean Valjean. Redemption is when you are free from sin or you make a change in your life for the better. That's from the verb to redeem oneself. We often use this in religion, especially if you're a sinner and you've been a bad person and you finally see the light and you decide to change your life and become a better person. You have redeemed yourself. So I guess Jean Valjean was kind of bitter and cynical for most of this story, but in the end, he came across someone who was really kind, and he changed his life around. He became happier and was more optimistic about human beings. So let's talk about this story, The Redemption of Jean Valjean. Again, this is an excerpt from this story. Jean Valjean had not had it easy. Now, this sentence begins kind of strangely. It says, had not had it easy. Why do we have so many hads there in this first part of the sentence?
Well, of course, because we're telling a story here, and often we'll use this past perfect form, sort of the past tense in the past tense. And often when we do that, we're saying this was the situation in the past, but it changed since that time in the past. So he had not had it easy back then when he was a child. And of course, that also gives us the idea that, well, later on, that changed, right? If we said he hasn't had it easy, that would be true from the past right up until just a second ago, basically right up until the present, but had not had it easy from when he was born until he left school, and then he won the lottery, or then he got a great job and his life was much better. So he had not had it easy in the earlier stages of his life. His life had been challenging and tough, and in that way of 19th century literature, extremely depressing. So let's find find out all the terrible things that happened to Jean Valjean before something a little bit better eventually happened to him. Thank goodness. Born in 1796 to a peasant family in France, oh, that's not good. He lost both parents as a child and was raised by his older sister. So born just after the French Revolution, when France was at war with itself and then with the rest of Europe until the fall of Napoleon. So a period of strife and turmoil and not exactly peaceful times in France. And he was born poor. He was born to a peasant family. These are the poorest level or poorest class in society, I guess. The people who work on the land in the countryside and don't own the land. So they're not quite slaves, but they're people who are working for just tiny amounts of money for rich landlords and earls and barons and dukes and things like that. The kind of people the peasants had eventually risen up and overthrew in the revolution, but still a very poor class of people. That's where he grew up. He lost both his parents as a child, so he was an orphan, and he was raised by his older sister. So basically children taking care of children because there's no one else around to help. This is not a good beginning.
So Jean's older sister raised him or took care of him. So when her husband died soon after Jean turned 25, Jean took on the burden of supporting her and her 7 young children.
7 children.
That is a big burden indeed. So if you take something on, you accept the responsibility of something. So he took on the burden, or he accepted the responsibility of supporting her and her children. So here we've got the word to support. Here it means that he was basically working to provide money and protection for his sister and her children because, hey, she's a mother of 7 children. She probably doesn't have a lot of time to go off to the office all day long.
That's right. And of course, someone has to put food on the table and make a little bit of extra money to, buy all the other things that they need. That was Jean's responsibility. So let's find out how he did that by checking out some of his jobs and the things that he was doing in order to support all these people who depended on him. This comes up in the second part of the article.
Jean did his best to provide for his struggling family. His main income was from tree pruning, but since that work was seasonal, he also performed various other forms of exhausting labor to make ends meet, such as tending cattle and raking hay. Despite his efforts, feeding 9 mouths was an enormous challenge, and the family endured periods of desperate hunger.
第二部分看到形容词 enormous 表示巨大的或是极大的，例如 There is an enormous clock tower at the center of the town. 在该城镇的中心有一座巨大的钟楼，或是 The impact of the pandemic on the economy was enormous. 那场疫情大流行对经济的影响很巨大。继续看到动词 endure， 它的意思是忍受、遭受，也可以是忍耐的意思。例如 Soldiers must endure challenging conditions during their missions. 士兵在任务期间必须忍受考验人的环境。也可以说Francis had to endure a long and difficult journey to reach the camp. Francis 得忍受漫长艰辛的旅程才能抵达营地。再来介绍形容词 desperate， 表示急需要的、非常的，也可以是非常严重的或是绝望的。可以说 The refugees were in desperate need of food and shelter. 难民急需食物和庇护所。又或者说 People were desperate to escape the sinking ship. 人们拼命要逃出那艘正在下沉的船。另外补充这个字的名词 desperation， D-E-S-P-E-R-A-T-I-O-N desperation， 指绝望或是孤注一掷。找个例句 After losing her job and home, Sylvia had a feeling of desperation. 失去工作和家之后 Sylvia 有一种绝望的感觉。另一句The woman called out in desperation when her child fell in the river. 当那名女子的孩子掉进河里时，她绝望地呼喊着。
All right, it's time for us to talk about the second part of our article for today. It continues. Jean did his best to provide for this struggling family. So if you're struggling, you're having a difficult time with life, okay? You're having difficulty making enough money to pay your bills. You might be kicked out of your apartment by your landlord or something like that, or you can't afford to even buy a bicycle or a bus ticket or something. So, yeah, you're having a hard time with life. You are struggling.
And, of course, he didn't have an illustrious career. He wasn't a doctor, a lawyer, some kind of businessman or merchant. He worked with his hands and he worked outside. His main income was from tree pruning. But since that work was seasonal, he also performed various other forms of exhausting labor to make ends meet, such as tending cattle and raking hay. He was a hard-working blue-collar guy. He worked with his hands. He worked outside. His main job was tree pruning. Okay, that's an interesting job. I guess it takes a certain amount of skill and a comfort being high up on a ladder or in a tree, because basically you're trimming trees in the same way that humans go to a barber to get a haircut. A tree might go to a tree pruner to get a leaf cut or a branch cut. Tree pruners will go out probably at the end of the year or something, and they'll trim the trees back, they'll cut them back, keep them nice and healthy, stop them from getting too big so that their branches break off or hurt people or something like that. So they're kind of tending to the tree in the same way that a gardener tends to plants. A tree pruner will tend to a tree to make sure that these large, beautiful growing things that might cover our streets and our parks and whatnot are nice and healthy. But that work, as it says, was seasonal. You can't prune a tree in the middle of the winter and it's covered in snow and ice, and of course the tree stops growing, so there's not really any point to pruning a tree in the middle of winter. If work is seasonal, that means it goes based on the seasons. So if you're a lifeguard at the beach or something, that would be a seasonal job. If you're a ski instructor, that would be a seasonal job. You do your lifeguarding during the hot summer months. You do your ski instructing on the ski slopes during the winter. But then during the rest of the year, you need to find other work, right? You need to find other sources of income. So he performed various other forms of exhausting labor, very hard physical manual labor. It's exhausting. It makes your body very tired. You fall into bed at the end of the day, barely able to take your shoes off because you're so tired. And of course, it could also be very damaging to your body, right? Working outside all the time, climbing, lifting, bending over, very tough on your bones and muscles and whatnot, and very tiring, exhausting. So he did all this, though, to make ends meet. When we say to make ends meet, we basically mean to afford or get the money to pay for the things that you need. If you're struggling to make ends meet, at the end of the month, you don't have as much money as you need for your basic requirements, for your rent and your bills and your food and stuff like that. We're not talking about luxuries. We're talking about the basics of life. If you make ends meet, you're doing okay. You have enough to support your lifestyle. If you don't make ends meet, well, you're going to have to find more money somehow or cut back so your costs go down. So he did other things to make money, in other words, tending cattle, raking hay. So he's out there in the fields with the cattle, and he's also raking hay, I believe, would probably mean collecting the hay at the end of the summer season. Hay would be the dried grass that animals will eat during the winter when the fields are covered with snow. And this would happen probably in late August, September. They would hire a lot of peasants to go out there and collect thousands of kilograms, tons of hay. But again, very physical, back-breaking manual labor.
And despite his efforts, feeding 9 mouths was an enormous challenge, and the family endured periods of desperate hunger. So, yeah, we often say this, to feed mouths in the family. You're another mouth to feed. I have to be responsible for you. I have to make enough money so that you can have enough to eat. And yes, he had to feed himself, his sister, and her 7 children, 9 people. So he had 9 mouths to feed. That was an enormous challenge. Enormous just means big, huge, colossal, very large. And of course, it was a big challenge for him, and they endured periods of desperate hunger. To endure just means to experience something that is very difficult. If you live in Antarctica, for example, you might endure the harsh winters down there because it's quite difficult. And desperate just means you really need something really badly. If you don't get it, you're going to be in big trouble. Oh, I'm desperate to find a new job. I don't have any money. I need to pay my bills, so I'm desperate to find work. And of course, they suffered from desperate hunger. Okay, we're at the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Here's the third part.
It was in one of these moments of desperation that the family's miserable situation worsened significantly. One brutal winter, when work was scarce and the family had gone days without food, Jean made a fateful choice. He stole a loaf of bread from a bakery. He was caught almost immediately and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Toward the end of the 4th year, he made the first of 4 escape attempts, but it only succeeded in earning him more prison time. All told, he served 19 years behind bars and never saw his family again.
第3部分看到这个单字 miserable， 它是形容词，指令人难受的、痛苦的，也可以是悲惨的意思。例如 Linda had been miserable since her cat disappeared. Linda 自从她的猫不见之后，就一直很难过。再举一个例子 Evan's boss is making his life miserable. Evan 的老板让他的生活很痛苦。后面介绍形容词 brutal， 指的是严酷的或是残忍的。举例来说 The brutal working conditions led to widespread protests. 严苛的工作条件引发了广泛的抗议活动。又或者说 The nation is struggling with a brutal recession. 该国因为严酷的经济衰退而苦撑着。最后看到形容词 fateful， 表示决定性的或是有重大影响的。例如 The swimmer had a fateful encounter with a shark. 那名泳客与一只鲨鱼发生了攸关性命的巧遇。也可以说 Everything was going fine in Ted's life until the fateful morning on which he got into a car crash. Ted 的生活一切本来都很顺利，直到那个决定了命运的车祸早晨。
All right, we are back with the story of Jean Valjean, and so far the story is kind of depressing. It's kind of sad. He's got a tough life. He's got a lot of people to support in his family, mostly the children of his sister, and he's working many different jobs in order to make ends meet, to raise enough money to pay for not only his own lifestyle, but what, like 7 or 8 other people? His sister and her 7 young children. So times are tough for him, and it says it was in one of these moments of desperation that the family's miserable situation worsened significantly. Oh my gosh, how can it get worse? It's already very miserable, as it says there. That's a great adjective to talk about things being very bad. In a situation you're really not happy, if you're feeling miserable, maybe you're sad, maybe you're depressed, maybe you're sick, maybe you just got a cold and it just makes your life really hard. Sometimes you might look out the window and it's blowing wind and rain and gray, cloudy skies and cold. How's the weather out there? It's miserable. Let's just stay home, watch movies, and order pizza, and please hand me that blanket because I'm cold. It's so miserable. It's so terrible and sad and depressing and really not very good. And so his bad situation worsened significantly. To worsen is to get worse, to become more bad, significantly in a big way. So it was already a bad situation, and then it got much worse in a major way. Good Lord, what happened? One brutal winter, it says, when work was scarce and the family had gone days without food, Jean made a fateful choice. He stole a loaf of bread from a bakery. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, well, not the worst crime in the world, especially when you're starving and your whole family is, but back then, I don't think people would have cared too much. Justice could have been pretty harsh back in those days, especially for poor people. So this is a brutal winter. When we talk about brutal, it's kind of mean and cruel and nasty, sometimes physically violent. A brutal attack by someone might end up with the person attacked going to the hospital and the person who attacked them going to jail for a long time because it was very violent, very vicious and cruel. But we can also talk about weather actually as being brutal. The sun can be brutal on a really hot day in Taiwan, often in the summer. The heat can be brutal. You go outside and within 30 seconds you're sweating, or it's really cold. Maybe you're in Canada and it's minus 30 outside with blowing wind and it feels like minus 50. Oh, it's brutal. It's very harsh and almost vicious. So it was a very cold, nasty winter. Work was scarce. He couldn't prune any trees. He couldn't find any other work. He was poor. He was jobless. He had no income. The family family had gone days without food. They've been eating their boots and boiling books to eat paper and things like that, or eat the glue out of the paper, some of the things that people did back then when they couldn't get food. So he made a fateful choice. He made a choice that had a big impact. When something is fateful, it kind of turns your fortune, it turns your fate, it changes your destiny. If you left home and moved off in search of your fortune, that could be a fateful choice. Maybe you did really well in your new location and you succeeded and thrived, or maybe you went there and got into all sorts of trouble and your life just got worse and worse and worse. But it's like that decision point, that one moment of inflection when things could have gone good or could have gone bad, and whatever happened, that was a fateful choice. It was a very important decision, or a very important sort of place where the road forked off. You could have gone left, you could have gone right, but either way would have been very different from the opposite. And so what happened on that day? Well, he stole a loaf of bread from a bakery.
Yep, that was fateful. Don't confuse this word with the word fatal. Fatal means it caused death, like it was a fatal accident. Someone died in the car accident. But here, fateful means it's going to have consequences in the future. It will change your life. And yes, how did his life change? Well, he stole a loaf of bread from a bakery. That's how bread is sold sometimes, in loaves. Okay, go buy me a loaf of bread so we can make sandwiches. And yes, that's what he did. And maybe the owner of the bakery had had enough. Too many people are taking bread, so I'm going to throw the book at this guy. He's going to suffer. He's going to go to jail. He was caught almost immediately and sentenced to 5 years in prison. So, of course, if you're caught for a crime, the judge will give you your punishment. You'll be sentenced to prison, or you'll be sentenced to death, depending on the crime. Here, he was going to go to prison for 5 years.
Toward the end of the 4th year, so he's almost finished his 5-year sentence. Toward the end of the 4th year, he made the first of 4 escape attempts. So he tried to escape from prison, which, of course, if you're caught, will mean you staying in prison even longer. But, yeah, it didn't work. It only succeeded in earning him more prison time. They caught him as he's climbing the wall or whatever, and they're like, right, you were going to let you go next year, but now we're going to keep you for another 3 years or 5 years. And he did this 4 times. So all told, when you add it all up, in the end, he served 19 years behind bars, in jail. In other words, if you're behind bars, you're in prison, you're in jail, and never saw his family again. So this absolutely ruined his life and the life of his family. You can see how stealing that loaf of bread was a fateful choice. He got caught, and it changed everything. Imagine 19 years in jail for stealing a loaf of bread to feed your starving family. That was justice back in those days, and it came down hard on old Jean Valjean. So that kind of sets us up well for the good things that hopefully will happen in his life, because so far it's been pretty dark and depressing.
Well, here's somebody who would never be sentenced to a prison term, our dear teacher Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第2部分一开始写到 Jean did his best to provide for this struggling family. Jean 他竭尽所能地抚养这个挣扎求生的家庭。那这边有2个重点。首先Do one's best 或者是 try one's best 表示全力以赴竭尽所能，之后常常会接不定词 to be 来表达尽全力做某事。那补充一下 one's best 它可以指说某人最大的努力，或者是表达最佳状况。我们这边就来看几个跟 one's best 有关的用法。第一个是At one's best 它可以描述某人或某事物处于最佳情形，处于全盛状态，像是Richard is an early bird. He's at his best in the morning. Richard 是早起的人，他在早上是处于最佳状态。第2个补充的是 look one's best， 这是指呈现某人最好的一面，像 Diane has a date tonight and wants to look her best. Diane 今晚有约会，她想要打扮得漂漂亮亮，呈现出自己最好的一面。那么第3个补充的是 feel one's best， 这是表达觉得身体处于良好状态，很健康，像是 I'm not feeling my best today. 意思就是我今天觉得不太舒服，不是自己的最佳状态这样。好，那么第二个重点是文中用到 provide for this struggling family 来表达说抚养这个挣扎求生的家庭，其中的 struggling 是用现在分词来当形容词，表达说是艰难奋斗的，是苦苦挣扎的。另外 provide for somebody 是表达抚养、供养或者是为什么来提供生活所需。举例来说 He has a large family to provide for 就是他要养活一个大家庭。那这边也顺便补充 provide 的其他用法。动词 provide 它表示提供给予，我们要表达提供某人某事物，可以用到 provide somebody with something 或者是 provide something to somebody 或 for somebody。 所以注意介系词不同， with 后面是接提供的事物，那么 to 跟 for 是接提供的对象。好，举例来说 The hotel provides excellent service to its guests 或者是 The hotel provides its guests with excellent service 那间饭店为顾客提供优质服务。好，那还有一个用法是 provide against 它可以表达预防、防备或是防止的意思。 provide against something 就可以表达为某事做准备，预防某事。那这通常是指未来有可能发生的不好的情况，像如果说 provide against floods 就是表达做好防范淹水的准备。好，那以上是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天的单字吧。
Peasant. The king imposed heavy taxes on the peasants, making their lives even harder. Enormous. When she learned that she had passed the exam, Patricia felt an enormous sense of relief. Endure. Howard had to endure years of poverty and struggle before finally achieving success. Desperate. After several days without food, the lost hikers were in desperate need of help. Miserable. Kelsey has been miserable in her new job because of the long hours and low pay. Brutal. The people of the captured town suffered brutal treatment from the enemy soldiers. Fateful.
Josh made a fateful decision on that stormy night and changed his destiny forever.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I am Mike.
See you next time.